Homelessness, it's a word that conjures images of people huddled on park benches, clutching worn-out blankets, or sitting silently on street corners with cardboard signs. But what does it really mean to live without a home? To wake up each day not knowing where your next meal will come from or if you'll have a safe place to sleep that night. For over 500,000 people in the U.S. and millions more globally, this isn't a fleeting thought, it's their reality. The challenges of homelessness are immense, but the emotional toll is often overlooked. Imagine walking down the street, feeling the stares or worse, being completely invisible to the world around you. People act like I don't exist, one man once shared. They cross the street to avoid me, like I'm contagious. That's the pain of homelessness, not just the lack of a roof over your head, but the loss of dignity, identity, and connection. For the homeless, every day feels like an uphill battle. The lack of basic necessities, clean clothes, a warm shower, or even a toothbrush, can erode a person's sense of self. It's not just about survival, it's about trying to hold onto a shred of humanity in a world that seems determined to strip it away. Then there's the stigma. How often have we heard phrases like, "Why don't they just get a job?" or "They must have made bad choices to end up like that." These assumptions are like daggers, perpetuating harmful stereotypes that make it even harder for those experiencing homelessness to get back on their feet. But the reality is far more complicated. Many of these individuals are victims of circumstances beyond their control: job losses, medical crises, domestic violence, or mental health struggles. They're not just statistics, they're people with dreams, fears, and stories worth telling. Picture this: a man sits on a bench outside a busy diner. His hair is disheveled, his clothes worn thin from months of wear. He's clutching a small paper cup, hoping for a few spare coins. The diner's patrons pass him by without a second glance, caught up in their own lives. Inside, the warm aroma of coffee and sizzling bacon fills the air, a stark contrast to the cold reality just beyond the door. Occasionally, someone might toss him some change, avoiding eye contact as they rush off. To them, he's just another homeless man, a faceless figure in a sea of urban chaos. But to him, every coin represents a glimmer of hope, a chance to make it through another day. "Excuse me, ma'am, could you spare a little?" he once asked a woman leaving the diner. She hesitated, fumbling with her bag before muttering, "Sorry, I don't have cash." Her eyes darted away, and she hurried off, guilt etched on her face. This isn't an uncommon scene. Most people feel torn between wanting to help and not knowing how, or fearing that their help might be misused. "What if they spend it on drugs?" is a common refrain. These doubts, though well-intentioned, often prevent any meaningful connection or aid. The homeless man outside the diner wasn't just another statistic. He had a name, a history, and a heart full of memories, some good, some haunting. But in the eyes of the world, he was invisible. Each rejection chipped away at his confidence, leaving behind a shell of the person he once was. Yet, despite the hardships, he held on to a flicker of hope. Maybe tomorrow, he'd whisper to himself. Maybe tomorrow, someone will see me, really see me. The diner owner had noticed him lingering nearby for weeks. At first, she felt the same hesitation many others did. Should she give him food? What if he causes trouble? But one day, she decided to act. "Hey," she called out, stepping outside with a steaming cup of coffee. "Would you like something warm to drink?" The man's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, ma'am. "Thank you." As he took the cup, their hands briefly touched, a simple human connection that spoke volumes. "Do you want to come inside?" "It's warmer in here," she offered. His face flushed with embarrassment. "I don't want to bother anyone." "You're not bothering anyone," she reassured him. "Come on in." Moments like these are rare for the homeless. They're used to being ignored, avoided, or judged. But for this man, that single act of kindness cracked the shell of isolation he'd been living in. Inside, the warmth of the diner enveloped him. The hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the scent of freshly brewed coffee, it was a sensory overload compared to the harsh, silent streets. Patrons glanced at him but said nothing, some offering polite smiles while others averted their gaze. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite of the sandwich she brought him. His hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or nerves, she couldn't tell. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. In that moment, the diner owner realized something profound. This wasn't just about feeding someone, it was about restoring a sense of humanity. She couldn't solve homelessness, but she could make a difference, one small act at a time. The challenges faced by the homeless aren't just about resources, they're about connection. It's about seeing people for who they are, not where they've ended up. That day, the diner became more than just a restaurant. It became a place where kindness and compassion broke through the walls of judgment and stigma. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who's willing to see beyond the surface and say, "Come on in." The morning was cold, colder than it had been all week. A biting wind swept through the streets, making the homeless man pull his thin jacket tighter around his frail body. His fingers, red and raw, clenched his paper cup, now half crushed from repeated gripping. He wasn't sure why he always chose this diner. Was it the warm yellow glow of its windows, the cheerful buzz of laughter that spilled out whenever the door swung open, or the tantalizing aroma of bacon and pancakes wafting into the air? Maybe it was the simple hope that someone, anyone, might see him as more than a shadow. Inside, Mary, the diner owner, had noticed him again. She'd seen him there almost every morning, sitting on the same bench, trying to stay out of the way. He never begged loudly or approached people aggressively like others sometimes did. No, this man was quiet, almost invisible, except for the rare moments when his hoarse voice broke through the cold air to ask, "Spare change, please?" Today was different. Today, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. He looked so defeated, she thought, watching him from behind the counter. What's his story? Does he have family? How did he end up here? Questions swirled in her mind, but one rose above the rest. What if I could help him? "Ma, you're staring again," her teenage son Tommy teased, snapping her out of her thoughts. "You thinking of inviting him in?" Mary glanced at her son. "Maybe I am," she said softly. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "What if he causes trouble? Or scares off customers?" Mary sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "And what if he doesn't? What if he just needs a chance?" With that, she made up her mind. She grabbed a fresh cup of coffee, poured it to the brim, and stepped outside. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she pushed forward. "Excuse me, sir," she called out. The man flinched, as if he wasn't used to hearing someone speak directly to him. He looked up, his eyes cautious but curious. "Yes?" Mary offered a warm smile. "Would you like some coffee?" He hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to laugh at him or shoo him away. When he realized she was serious, his expression softened. That would be nice. "Thank you." As she handed him the cup, their eyes met. His were tired, sunken, but there was a glimmer of gratitude that shone through. "You don't have to sit out here in the cold," Mary added. "Why don't you come inside? I'll get you something to eat." The man froze. Go inside? Into the warmth of the diner? He shook his head quickly. "No, I can't. I don't want to bother anyone." "You're not bothering anyone," Mary said firmly, but kindly. "Come on. It's warmer in there." The man hesitated, his hands gripping the cup tightly as if it were his lifeline. I don't want to be a problem. People don't like seeing someone like me in places like that." Mary's heart ached at his words. "Let me worry about that," she said gently. "Please, come in." Finally, he nodded, though his movements were cautious and slow, like someone testing the waters for hidden dangers. He followed her inside, his footsteps hesitant as if he feared he'd be thrown out at any moment. The warmth of the diner enveloped him immediately, a stark contrast to the icy streets outside. The chatter of customers, the clinking of plates, and the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling sausages created an atmosphere so inviting it was almost overwhelming. As they walked toward a booth in the corner, a few patrons glanced up. Some smiled politely, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Mary noticed, but chose to ignore it. "Have a seat," she said, gesturing to the booth. The man sat down gingerly, as though the chair might break under him. His hands rested on the table, trembling slightly. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "What's your name?" Mary asked as she slid a menu in front of him. "James," he replied after a pause. "James Tucker." "Well, James," Mary said, "you take your time. Order whatever you'd like, it's on the house." James looked up sharply. "I couldn't. I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Mary said with a smile. "It's just breakfast." Tears welled up in James' eyes, but he blinked them away quickly, not wanting to show too much emotion. He glanced at the menu, his fingers brushing over the laminated surface as if he hadn't held one in years. "Maybe just some eggs," he said hesitantly. "How about eggs, toast, and bacon?" Mary offered. James nodded, swallowing hard. "That sounds really nice." As Mary walked back to the kitchen to place his order, she noticed a subtle change in the diner. The air felt lighter, as if her act of kindness had sent ripples through the room. One regular, an older gentleman named Hank, leaned over to his wife. "That's a good thing she's doing," he whispered. When the plate of food arrived, James stared at it for a moment, almost as if he couldn't believe it was real. Then, slowly, he picked up his fork and took a bite. The warmth of the eggs, the crispness of the bacon, it was more than just a meal, it was a reminder that someone cared. "I don't know how to thank you," James said after a while, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to," Mary replied. "Just promise me one thing, don't give up on yourself, okay?" James nodded, his eyes shining. "I'll try." The encounter might have seemed small to some, but in that moment, it felt monumental. For James, it was more than breakfast. It was hope, dignity, and a brief return to humanity. And for Mary, it was a reminder that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can spark the biggest changes. As James finished his meal, the diner seemed a little warmer, a little brighter. Maybe it was the food, or maybe it was the simple power of connection. Either way, something had shifted, and Mary couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. James sat quietly at the corner booth, the remnants of his meal before him. The once warm eggs were now cold, and the bacon grease had hardened on the plate, but none of that mattered anymore. For the first time in years, he felt full, not just in his stomach but in his soul. Mary, the diner owner, had given him more than a meal, she'd given him a sense of worth. But not everyone in the diner shared her sentiment. "Mary," a sharp voice called out from across the room. It was Ruth, one of the regulars, a sharp-tongued woman who prided herself on being honest to a fault. "Can I have a word with you?" Mary set down the coffee pot she'd been refilling and walked over, a polite smile plastered on her face. "What can I do for you, Ruth?" Ruth leaned in, her voice low but her tone cutting. "Are you sure it's a good idea letting him in here? People like that, they bring trouble. Don't you watch the news?" Mary's smile faltered, but her resolve didn't. "James isn't trouble," she said firmly. "He's just a man who needed a hot meal. That's all." Ruth sniffed, unimpressed. "A man who's probably here to case the place." "Don't be naive, Mary. You'll regret this." Mary's voice was steady, but her heart raced. "I'm not going to regret kindness, Ruth." She turned on her heel, leaving Ruth to fume. James had heard the exchange, how could he not? Ruth's voice carried like a storm. He shrank in his seat, his shoulders hunched as if he could make himself disappear. He hated this feeling, the shame, the guilt, the constant sense that he was a burden. As Mary returned to his table, James looked up, his eyes filled with apology. I should go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "No, you shouldn't," Mary said, sliding into the booth across from him. "You're not leaving because of her. But she's right, James trailed off, his voice cracking. I don't belong here. People like me, we're just a problem. Mary leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. James, listen to me. You're not a problem. You're a person, a good person. Don't let someone like Ruth make you think otherwise. James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the front door swung open with a bang. A man in a suit stepped inside, his face red with anger. Where is he? He demanded, his voice booming. The entire diner went silent. James froze. He recognized the man instantly, one of the shop owners from down the street. He tried to sweep the man's storefront once in exchange for a few dollars, but the man had chased him off, shouting obscenities. You, the man bellowed, pointing at James. What are you doing in here? Mary stood up, her hands on her hips. Excuse me, sir, but you don't get to barge into my diner and shout at my guests. Your guests? The man sneered. That's not a guest, that's a bum who's been loitering outside my store for weeks. He's trouble, I'm telling you. James sank lower in his seat, his face burning with humiliation. Mary's voice rose, clear and strong. He's not trouble. He's my guest, and you're the one causing a scene. The man's face turned an even deeper shade of red. You'll regret this, Mary, he growled. People like him don't change. They just take and take until there's nothing left. The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. James couldn't take it anymore. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He's right, he said, his voice shaking. I should go. I don't want to cause any more problems. James, sit down, Mary said, her tone gentle but firm. No, James insisted, his voice growing louder. You've done enough for me. I shouldn't have come in here. I don't belong here. Mary grabbed his hand, stopping him in his tracks. Her grip was strong, stronger than he expected. You do belong here, James, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. You belong anywhere kindness exists. The diner was silent again, but this time, it wasn't just the weight of conflict hanging in the air, it was something more profound. Something transformative. Then, from the back of the diner, a voice broke through. I'll cover his next meal, Hank, an elderly regular, said, his voice steady. And I'll pitch in too, added Lisa, a waitress who had been silently watching the scene unfold. Slowly, other voices joined in. Count me in. Me too. The man in the suit looked around, incredulous. You're all crazy, he spat before storming out. James stood there, stunned. Why are they doing this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because they see what I see, Mary said, smiling through her tears. Someone who's worth helping. For the first time in years, James felt something he thought he'd lost forever, hope. The diner buzzed with life again as people returned to their meals, but the atmosphere had shifted. What started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much bigger, a community standing together, proving that compassion could triumph over cynicism. As James sat back down, still reeling from what had just happened, Mary placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. This one's on Hank, she said with a wink. James laughed, a real, genuine laugh. It felt strange, almost foreign, but it was good. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. And for the first time in forever, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The story of James and Mary reminds us that even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples of change. Imagine a world where one meal, one conversation, or one moment of compassion could restore hope to someone who thought they'd lost it forever. What if every person chose to see the humanity in others, rather than the flaws? In a diner filled with ordinary people, extraordinary kindness sparked a transformation, not just for James, but for an entire community. So, what's stopping us from doing the same? Kindness isn't just a gesture, it's a lifeline. Let's cast it freely.